March 6, 1944. 6 miles above Berlin, Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson felt his B-17 shudder as flak burst close enough to pepper the fuselage with shrapnel. Through breaks in the smoke, he could see the city spread below in crystalline afternoon light, every street and building visible. Somewhere down there, in a bunker or headquarters building, Adolf Hitler was learning that American heavy bombers were over his capital in broad daylight. For the second time in 3 days, the Führer, according to those present, refused to believe it at first. This moment had been coming for 4 years, building through layers of broken promises and accumulating evidence that Germany's air defenses were crumbling. But the path to this March afternoon, with over 600 American bombers hammering Berlin while Hitler raged in denial, had begun with a boast that would haunt the Third Reich. August 1939. Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal and commander of the Luftwaffe, stood before a crowd in the Ruhr industrial region and made a promise that would define his legacy. "If enemy bombers reach the Ruhr," he declared, his chest heavy with medals, "you can call me Maya." It was a Jewish surname, the joke obvious. Göring was staking his reputation, his name itself, on the impossibility of enemy aircraft penetrating German airspace. Hitler believed him. Why wouldn't he? The Luftwaffe had swept through Poland, terrorized Rotterdam, brought Britain to its knees during the Blitz. German fighters were superior. German tactics were proven. German air defenses were impenetrable. When Göring promised that no enemy bomber would reach Berlin, Hitler built his strategy around that certainty. The first cracks appeared in August 1940, when RAF bombers reached Berlin at night. Hitler's response was immediate and furious, but directed outward. "If they attack our cities," he announced, "we will raze theirs to the ground." The Blitz against London was his answer, a demonstration of German air power that would force Britain to surrender. Berlin's air raid sirens were an aberration, a temporary nuisance that the Luftwaffe would soon eliminate. But the RAF kept coming. Through 1941, through 1942, through 1943, British bombers found Berlin in darkness. The raids grew heavier. November 18, 1943 marked the beginning of what RAF Bomber Command called the Battle of Berlin, a sustained campaign that would send over 400 heavy bombers against the city night after night. By March 1944, the RAF had conducted 16 major raids on the capital, killing approximately 10,000 Berliners and destroying or damaging over 1.5 million dwellings. Hitler stopped visiting bombed cities after 1943. Albert Speer, his armaments minister, later wrote that the Führer couldn't face the reality of the destruction, couldn't meet the eyes of those who'd lost everything despite his promises of protection. Instead, Hitler retreated into his headquarters, surrounded by maps and reports that he increasingly refused to believe. The night raids were bad enough, but night bombing was imprecise, scattershot, something Hitler could frame as terror attacks on civilians rather than military operations. The RAF dropped their bombs through clouds and smoke, hitting residential areas, creating firestorms, but rarely destroying specific factories or infrastructure with precision. Hitler's propaganda machine could work with this, could portray British bombers as barbaric terror weapons while promising German retaliation. American bombers were different. The United States Army Air Forces believed in daylight precision bombing. Their B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew in broad daylight in formation, protected by increasingly sophisticated defensive armament and, eventually, long-range fighter escorts. They aimed for specific targets: ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries, marshalling yards. They came in weather clear enough to see their targets, which meant Berliners could see them too. Silver specks at high altitude trailing white contrails across the sky. For Hitler, this was categorically different. This was the American military-industrial complex, the arsenal of democracy he dismissed as incapable of projecting power across the Atlantic, flying over his capital in daylight. flying where German citizens could watch them, count them, see with their own eyes that the Luftwaffe couldn't stop them. The first American bombs fell on Berlin March 4, 1944. Approximately 730 B-17s and B-24s from the 8th Air Force, escorted by P-51 Mustang fighters with drop tanks that gave them the range to reach the capital and back, hit targets across the city in afternoon light. German fighters rose to meet them. Flak batteries fired until their barrels glowed. But the Americans came through, dropped their bombs, and most flew home. 2 days later, they came back. 660 heavy bombers, again in daylight, again hitting Berlin while the sun was still up. Lieutenant Johnson was in one of those B-17s, watching flak burst around his aircraft, seeing German fighters diving through the bomber formations, feeling the aircraft shake as bombs released from the bay below. On the ground, Berliners who'd survived years of night raids now watched American bombers overhead in clear afternoon light. The psychological impact was profound. Night bombing was terrifying, but invisible, something that happened in darkness and smoke. Daylight raids were undeniable. You could see the bombers, you could count them, you could watch the contrails and know with absolute certainty that German air defenses had failed. In his headquarters, Hitler received the reports. The accounts vary, filtered through the memoirs and testimonies of those present, but the core reaction was consistent: rage, disbelief, and a desperate search for someone to blame. According to multiple witnesses, Hitler initially accused his own intelligence services of exaggerating American bomber numbers. This couldn't be accurate. The Americans didn't have this many heavy bombers in England. They couldn't have built this many aircraft. The reports must be inflated. Defeatist propaganda from within his own military. When presented with evidence, including reconnaissance photographs and reports from multiple sources, Hitler's fury turned toward the Luftwaffe. Where were the fighters? Why weren't the flak batteries stopping them? How had Göring, who'd promised Berlin would never be bombed, allowed American aircraft to fly over the capital in broad daylight? Göring, once Hitler's designated successor, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, had become a figure of ridicule. His morphine addiction was known among the leadership. His weight had ballooned. His increasingly fantastic promises about new aircraft and wonder weapons were met with skepticism even within the Nazi hierarchy. But Hitler had built too much around Göring's assurances to abandon him completely. Instead, the Führer's rage scattered across the entire Luftwaffe command structure. General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, later described meetings where Hitler refused to accept reality about the air war. When Galland reported that German fighters were outnumbered, outperformed by American P-51s, and running out of experienced pilots, Hitler accused him of defeatism. When Galland explained that German aircraft production couldn't keep pace with losses, Hitler pointed to Speer's statistics showing increased production and demanded to know why these aircraft weren't stopping the bombers. The gap between Hitler's understanding and reality had become a chasm. Speer's production numbers were real. German factories were producing more aircraft than ever despite the bombing. But those aircraft were being destroyed faster than they could be delivered. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than replacements could be trained. The fuel to fly the aircraft was increasingly scarce as American bombers systematically destroyed synthetic oil plants. Hitler's response to these realities was to retreat further into fantasy about retaliation. He spoke obsessively about the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets under development, weapons that would rain destruction on London and force Britain out of the war. He promised that new jet fighters would sweep American bombers from German skies. He insisted that the bombing campaign would break Allied morale before it broke German morale, that the Western powers would sue for peace once they understood the cost of their air offensive. But in March 1944, with American bombers over Berlin in daylight and RAF bombers returning each night, Hitler's promises rang hollow even to true believers. The round-the-clock bombing was the key. The RAF's night raids had been devastating, but they'd given German workers daylight hours to clear rubble, restore utilities, and maintain production. American daylight raids eliminated that recovery time. Berlin was under attack 24 hours a day. Air raid sirens wailed in afternoon and midnight. Workers spent their days in shelters instead of factories. The psychological toll was immense. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, recorded in his diary the challenge of maintaining morale in Berlin during this period. His entries from March 1944 describe a population exhausted by constant alerts, increasingly skeptical of official assurances, and openly questioning why the Luftwaffe couldn't stop the bombers. Goebbels, who'd built his career on controlling information, found himself unable to deny what Berliners could see with their own eyes. Hitler's reaction to Goebbels's reports was telling. Rather than address the reality of German air defense failures, the Führer demanded more propaganda about German retaliation. He wanted newsreels showing V-weapons in development. He wanted speeches promising that German wonder weapons would soon devastate Allied cities. He wanted the narrative shifted from German vulnerability to imminent German vengeance. This was Hitler's pattern throughout the air war's final year. Confronted with evidence of German weakness, he promised future strength. Told about aircraft losses, he spoke of jets under development. Informed about pilot casualties, he referenced training programs that would produce superior aviators. Presented with the reality of American bombers over Berlin, he threatened retaliation that would make the Allies regret their bombing campaign. But the threats were empty, and increasingly, Hitler seemed to know it. Speer later wrote about a meeting in March 1944, shortly after the first American daylight raids on Berlin, where Hitler sat silent for long periods, staring at maps, not responding to questions. The Führer, who'd once dominated every conversation, who'd talked for hours about strategy and tactics and the inevitable German victory, was retreating into silence. The silence was more disturbing than the rage. Hitler's fury at the Luftwaffe, his accusations of defeatism, his promises of retaliation, these were all active responses, attempts to impose his will on reality. But the silence suggested something worse, a growing awareness that reality was beyond his control, that the promises couldn't be kept, that German air defenses had failed and would continue failing. March 22, 1944. American bombers returned to Berlin, over 700 heavy bombers hitting the city in daylight. March 24th, over 800 bombers. The raids continued through spring, the Americans and British taking turns, Berlin under constant attack. German fighters rose to meet them, flak batteries fired, but the bombers kept coming. Hitler stopped asking for detailed reports about the raids. According to Speer, the Führer didn't want to hear casualty figures or damage assessments. He'd issue orders for increased fighter production, demand progress reports on jet aircraft development, insist that the V-weapons campaign be accelerated, but he wouldn't discuss the reality of what was happening over Berlin. This denial extended to his military planning. In meetings about the Eastern Front or the anticipated Allied invasion of France, Hitler would reference German air superiority as if it were still real. He'd plan operations that required air cover the Luftwaffe could no longer provide. He'd dismiss concerns about Allied air power with vague assurances that the situation would soon change. Generals who'd served Hitler for years watched this disconnect with growing alarm. Some, like Galland, tried to force Hitler to confront reality with detailed reports and undeniable evidence. Others learned to work around the Führer's delusions, making plans that accounted for Allied air superiority while pretending in Hitler's presence that German fighters still controlled the skies. The American daylight raids and RAF night raids continued through 1944 and into 1945. Berlin was bombed over 300 times during the war, with the heaviest raids coming after the Americans joined the campaign. By war's end, Approximately 50,000 Berliners had been killed by bombing, and roughly half the city's buildings were damaged or destroyed. But the physical destruction, as terrible as it was, wasn't the bombing campaign's most significant impact on Hitler. The psychological effect, the undeniable evidence that his promises were lies and his power was failing, may have been more devastating than the bombs themselves. Hitler had built his regime on certainty, on the promise that he alone could restore German greatness, that his will would overcome any obstacle, that belief in the Führer would guarantee victory. The sight of American bombers over Berlin in daylight, untouchable despite everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them, shattered that certainty. Goering's promise that Berlin would never be bombed had been broken thousands of times. Hitler's assurance that the Luftwaffe would protect German cities was revealed as fantasy. The narrative of German air superiority, so central to Nazi propaganda, collapsed under the weight of observable reality. And Hitler, confronted with this failure, could only rage and deny and retreat into promises of wonder weapons that would somehow reverse the irreversible. He never visited Berlin during the heavy raids of 1944 and 1945. He never toured the bombed districts or met with survivors. He remained in his bunker, surrounded by maps showing a Germany that no longer existed, planning campaigns with air support that wasn't available, promising victory that was impossible. The last American daylight raid on Berlin came April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday. Approximately 600 B-17s bombed the city while Soviet forces fought in the suburbs. 10 days later, Hitler was dead by his own hand in his bunker beneath the burning capital. What did Hitler say when he learned American bombers were over Berlin day and night? According to those who were there, he said many things. That the reports were exaggerated, that the Luftwaffe was defeatist, that retaliation was coming, that wonder weapons would turn the tide, that German will would prevail. But beneath all the words was a silence, a growing void where certainty had been, an awareness that he couldn't admit even to himself. That the war was lost, that his promises were broken, that the bombers overhead were proof of his failure. The round-the-clock bombing of Berlin wasn't just a military campaign. It was a daily, visible demonstration that Hitler's power had limits, that his will couldn't stop American industry or British determination, that the Third Reich he'd promised would last 1,000 years was crumbling after 12. Every bomber that flew over Berlin in daylight was evidence that Goering's promises were lies, and Hitler's assurances were fantasy. And Hitler, who'd built everything on the power of his word, on the certainty of his vision, on the inevitability of German victory, had no response except rage and denial and silence. The bombers kept coming, day and night, and all Hitler's fury couldn't stop them. That may have been the most devastating impact of the campaign, not the physical destruction, but the psychological reality that Hitler's will, for all his talk of triumph through belief, was powerless against the reality overhead. The Americans and British didn't just bomb Berlin. They bombed the myth of Hitler's invincibility, and they did it in daylight where everyone could see.